Dr. John Mulder, welcome to Dying to Tell You, the Caring Perspective. As you know, because we've talked before, Dying to Tell You is a podcast where I interview people who are coming to the end of their life. And as you also know, the people that we work with are our greatest teachers, the people that they kind of show us what life is about. And so the caring perspective really is an opportunity for me to connect with other healthcare providers, other healthcare workers, and get their learning. Like, what have you learned from the people that you've cared for as they've come to the end of their life? So that's what this is. And I know that, well, I'll let you introduce yourself and kind of tell us where you are and where you're from and like a little bit about your background.
Sure. Well, first, Cody, thanks for inviting me on. I appreciate your podcast, what you've done with that, the opportunity to give people voice and to be able to share their experience. And you're correct. We learn from each other. We learn from our patients. I continually learn from my patients. I don't learn from doctors all that much anymore, but I certainly do from the nurses, the social workers, chaplains, and certainly our patients and families. They teach me much. They keep me humble. And they keep me curious, and so it's really been quite fascinating. I work in the field of palliative medicine and hospice. I've been involved in that genre for probably close to 40 years. I started out in family medicine, did a lot of work in family medicine, and alongside that, I was doing some part-time hospice work, which put me at the bedside of dying patients. And over the years of doing that, I found more and more drawn to that particular field. So in 2000, then, after 15 years of part-time hospice and full-time family medicine, I went into full-time hospice and palliative medicine. Did some of that down in Tennessee, and then moved back to Michigan, which is where I'm from. And I've been back in Michigan for nearly 19 years now, doing full-time hospice and palliative work, working within hospital systems to help develop and run and staff palliative programs. I've worked with hospice organizations. I started training programs for young physicians who want to learn how to be hospice and palliative doctors. I've done some educational work and some legislative work and some regulatory work. And so it's just been an interesting journey for me along the way.
Yeah. Will you tell us a little bit about the Trillium Institute?
Sure. The Trillium Institute, we began about a decade ago as a palliative medicine think tank. We're all about educating. We're all about educating both the medical community and the lay community as well. Yeah. We really saw a need to develop both the supply and demand for palliative services. So that's what got me involved in educating in the healthcare system, as well as educating into the general public about what it is, what they should be asking for, what they really should be demanding as they are progressing through serious illness.
Right. I really appreciate it. And you have a podcast as well, Palliative Matters.
We do. That's one of our main outreach points. We're kind of humbled and surprised how many people actually download it, but it's been pretty amazing. And I do that with my colleague, Dr. Jason Beckrow, and we drop that once a month and have been using that as an opportunity to help to explore the field in more depth in terms of what we do, how we do it, why we do it, the response to that, and again, what people should know and what physicians should know about their patients as we approach these serious, challenging illnesses.
Right. All right. I really appreciate the podcast and the conversations that you're having there. It just makes it accessible for people who, I think it's great for providers and healthcare workers, but it's also accessible for people who are not in the field, which I think is really important. Like you said, what people should be asking for, demanding, expecting from their hospice teams, and as they come to the end of their life, I think it's really important.
That's the goal. We wanted to avoid medical ease and make it accessible to everybody.
Right. All right. Well, tell me a story.
Well, if I think about the stories that have impacted me and that have stuck with me, there's one in particular that I think is relevant to we're trying to get across and things that we've learned about death and dying. And I tell the students that I work with all the time that they will run into patients, sometimes early in their career, sometimes later, but they will indelibly be etched in their mind. They will never forget them, never forget the circumstances. They will remember how it smelled, how it felt, what it sounded like. Several years ago, and I mean, this goes back probably 22, 23 years. It's been a while. We had a woman that came into our inpatient hospice unit. I'll use the name Mary. She had been in our hospice in the community. She was in her 80s and had the medical term cholangiocarcinoma, which is a cancer of the gallbladder. At that age, and in many circumstances, it's a uniformly fatal cancer. People don't survive it. And she was gradually declining, although living alone and doing pretty well, until the point in which she really couldn't do very well on her own anymore. And so she came into her inpatient hospice unit and settled in. And from just about the time she arrived, she stopped eating and drinking. And that was also about the time that her son and a nephew of the man, her grandson, but not the man's son. So it was an uncle, nephew that were there, son and grandson of the patient. They both arrived from different states to hunker down, be by the bedside, and just kind of nurse their grandmother through the final moments of her life. When someone stops eating and drinking within this context, it's usually about a week and a half before they enter what we refer to as an actively dying stage and die shortly thereafter. I mean, the reality is, of course, if they're not eating and drinking, they have no food, they have no water. And so you can't really survive very long with that. And usually a week and a half, 2 weeks is about the limit. And she went about 2 weeks with no food, no water, and she entered her actively dying phase. And the two men asked me, well, how much longer do you think, Doc? And it's a question I get all the time.
Right.
It's probably one of the most common questions I get. And my standard response in an actively dying state is, 2, 3, maybe 4 days. I mean, plus we've got 2 weeks, no food, no water. And an actively dying stage is really when there are physiologic changes that tell us we have passed the point of no return. So her blood pressure has dropped. It's 60 over 0. Her heart rate is barely palpable. And when you can, it's very, very thready, very, very rapid, and very irregular. And her breathing becomes shallow and irregular and slow. In her case, she was breathing 4 times a minute. And I would challenge anyone, just try breathing 4 times a minute and see how you do.
It doesn't work. Yep.
It doesn't work. She was not responsive anymore, not responsive to voice or to touch. She had stopped urine output. And so this constellation of physiologic changes, breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, urine output, cognitive change, really suggested she is actively dying and she's not going to survive. 2 to 4 days, that's the max. So the men said, yep, okay, if that's what it is, we'll stay by the bedside. And so 2, 3, 4, 5 days come and go. 6 days, 7 days. So now we clearly, she apparently did not read the physiology text. She should have died.
She didn't know.
She didn't know. Yeah, so she didn't die. And and you could see that these men were getting progressively beleaguered. And, what can you do to put her out of her misery? I said, she's perfectly comfortable.
Right.
We can talk about your misery, but...
Right, that's exactly right. Yeah.
But she's perfectly comfortable. And our hospice team did a great job. They did all the things that you would expect them to do. Because the things that might cause people to linger have the son and the grandson given her permission to go. It's all right, Grandma. It's okay, Mom. Yes, they had. They were praying for that for her. And, we asked about spiritual, and no, she was right with God. All was good in that neighborhood. And so they kind of checked off the list, and there really was very little that they could look at to say, well, this is why. So they were, again, the men, a little disgruntled. She was comfortable, and I was perplexed. And that's how it went, day after day. We're a week and a half into this. I mean, I would wake up in the morning, and I would say, I didn't get the call overnight, which means I'm going to have to go back down into the room with 2 frustrated men and this woman who's breathing 4 times a minute. It was about 2 weeks into this, 2 weeks into actively dying, plus 2 weeks of no food, no water. And I'm walking down the hall, and I see that there's a woman standing outside the door as a sentry almost, hands crossed in a very defensive posture. And I don't know what I was thinking, but I just said, I'm just going to not make eye contact and walk straight past. And as I'm walking past, she says, "Are you the doctor?" And so, of course, yes, I am. And she said, "What's going on in there?" And I said, "I don't know. She won't die." And I said, "Who are you?" And her name was, she told me who I don't remember what her name was. She told me she was a friend of the family's. And the son had called her and told her that they were there. She lived in Nashville, so she came over just to support them. And I said, I don't know what's going on. We've tried to examine all the things that we could examine, and we were coming up dry. So I'm not sure really. We have no physiologic explanation. There clearly is an existential explanation for which we have no way of tapping into. And I say, anything you can think of. And she said, "No, I got nothing." And she says, "Well, wait a minute. She had a daughter." And she paused, and I thought, I didn't know that. That's the first I'd heard of a daughter. And she says, "Yeah, she died." I'm sorry. They separated about 25 years ago. I don't think anybody even remembers what the issues were that caused the estrangement. But it's been 25 years. Do you think that would have something to do with it? And I said, "Well, I don't know. It certainly could. Do you have any way of knowing how I could potentially get a hold of her?" So she had this large bag, and she reached into it and without hesitation pulled out, it looked just like this. Okay. I mean, it was just, she reached in and pulled it out.
A scrap of paper.
A scrap of paper about this size, ragged on there, with a penciled telephone number on it. Okay. There's no name, just, and she said, "I haven't talked with her in about 10 years, but this is the last number I have for her." And I looked and I said, "I'm amazed at your filing system."
Yeah.
That really is quite incredible.
Right.
And I looked at it and I said, "Well, we'll give it a try." So we went into the room, and son, grandson were there. Their usual. I mean, they were really tired. They were exhausted. I felt bad for them. We encouraged them to get out, get something to eat, get a nap, which they did. They did all those sorts of things, but just emotionally,
it's exhausting.
The weight of that emotionally, it really can't be measured. And also, I had one of my nurses was in there, and the social worker happened to be in there too, just to support the family. So there we were, the 2 staff, the 2 men, and the friend and myself, and the patient, of course. And I walked over to the bedside phone. This was back in the day. We had corded phones, right?
Right.
So I picked up the phone, and I dialed the number on this scrap of paper. And a woman answers, and I says, "Is this so-and-so?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, this is Dr. Mulder. I'm with Alive Hospice in Nashville, Tennessee. And I've been taking care of your mom for the last several weeks. She developed cancer a few months ago, and she's been progressing about how we would expect. She came to stay with us in our facility, and she's very, very near the end of her life. I understand you haven't had much contact with her in recent years. And I don't know why. I don't need to know why. But I do know that when these situations arise, oftentimes there are things that somebody wants to say to somebody. And so if there was anything you wanted to say to her mom before she died, this would be a good time to do it. I'll put the earpiece up next to her ear, and you can say whatever you want to say. And, she won't respond to you. But I'm very, very confident, based on my years of watching these sorts of things, that she'll know it's you, and she'll know what you're saying. So we did that. I put the phone up there, and you could hear the little chitter-chatter out of the earpiece. For all the world, I want to hit that speaker button on the
Yeah,
phone.
no kidding.
Eavesdrop in, but
Right.
I resisted the temptation.
Yeah.
I have some moral and ethical standards that I try to abide by. After about 5 minutes, we saw a tear come down the cheek of this woman. At first, we looked at it and said, "Is that what we think it is?" And that was followed by another and another, and then a flood, an absolute flood of tears. Somehow my scientific mind kicked in and said, "Where are those tears coming from? She has had no water in for a month.
Right.
How can she make tears?"
Yeah.
Of course, that is irrelevant. These were, these are tears from the heart. And everything that she had been holding for 2.5 decades was now being poured out. The daughter talked for about another chitter-chatter, another 5 minutes or so. And I pulled the phone back when I heard it stop. And I said, I described to her what we all saw, what we all witnessed, and how powerful that was. And I said, whatever you said to her made a profound difference. And whatever may have gone between you, consider it reconciled. I said, thank you so much. She thanked me. We hung up the phone. It wasn't 2 minutes later she took her last breath.
Yeah. Yeah.
Probably saw that one coming. I don't know how long she could have hung on until that. I've heard people say, people die when everything is complete. Well, I don't know. I mean,
yeah,
I've seen 6 and 8 year olds die, and I don't think that things are complete.
Right.
Maybe in God's eyes they are, but not in mine, and
right.
Not in my world is it ever right that happened. And even in our own lives, when my dad died very young, and I know that a lot of people in my family would argue that life was not complete for him. Mm-hmm. But at some level, what he needed to reconcile, he had reconciled, and he died. And so did Mary. When she was able to reconcile what was broken in her world, she was able to die. Could she have hung on for a few more hours, days, weeks until that moment happened? And what if that moment hadn't happened? What happens then?
Right.
The message that I take away from that, there's several. I think there's a number of different learning opportunities there. But the most important one is the whole issue of reconciliation. One of my big points, and if you've listened to the podcast, because virtually every podcast I talk about medicine as needing to be relational and not transactional. Our job is to figure out who these individuals are. What is their story? And to help them bring some level of completeness in their life, some resolution in their lives. And a lot of times that revolves around relationships. Sometimes they're very, very broken relationships. Sometimes they're relationships damaged beyond repair. We're not going to see kumbaya in that room. Right. But if we can allow patients to at least achieve a level of peace about how they live their life, about what they're, depending upon their faith structure, about their afterlife, about the things that matter, the people that are present, the people that are around the room, to really affirm that they are loved, they are cared for. People matter to her, and she matters to them, and she made a difference in their lives. For a lot of people, that's enough. But it's all about relationships. It's not about the morphine. It's not about the, which kind of casket are we going to buy, and are we going to cremate her, have an open casket? Doesn't matter. It's about love and being loved. It's about forgiving and being forgiven. And those are the things that I think that really can help to facilitate, to use a term that sometimes is misappropriated, but a good death.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that there are certainly ways in which people can, in fact, achieve that level of peace. It's what I strive for with my patients. And And if it's physical symptom management, great. I'm really good at that. We'll take care of that.
Yeah.
If it's the existential struggles, let's sit down and figure those out. If it's relational, let's figure that out. I mean, there's a lot of different things we can do about that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because that's what gets you a good death. It's the good death is not what I think a good death is or what you think a good death is. The good death is the death that is the best for that person and helps the family walk away as whole as possible, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And if you don't know who that person is or who that family is, if you're not paying attention to what's going on in the room, you can't know what a good death is for those people.
The other important thing about this is that in so many circumstances, I think there's a tendency, again, within a medical care system where things tend to be transactional, to forget that someone who appears obtunded, unresponsive, their soul is very much alive, very much awake, very much responsive. And I've used that with students all the time to say that when you walk in the room, you presume, regardless of their circumstance, that they are aware of your presence, that they are aware of your attitude, of your mood, of your approach, of your level of empathy, and that they will hear and understand the types of things that you're trying to tell them.
Yeah.
So you talk to them as if they were awake, as if they were conscious, as if they were able to respond.
Yeah.
To do anything less than that, I think, is disrespecting them as a person.
Yeah. Very dehumanizing. That's one of the things I do. I mean, I'm inpatient all the time. I do a lot of work in the ICU. And one of the things I really appreciate about the nurses where I work is they treat those people who are intubated and sedated and sometimes paralyzed as though they are completely awake and alert and participating. So they will tell them exactly who they are and what they're doing, and they treat them with that kind of respect and care. And I really appreciate that, because not only because it is the right thing to do, many people come out of that and tell us they heard and understand exactly what's happening.
Exactly. And they know those people now.
Yeah. Yeah. They do know them, and they know that those people were there because they cared and they were caring for them. And I think that's really important for somebody in a situation like that is so vulnerable, to know that there are people around that care. So, yeah. What a great story.
Well, I think, again, it's one where, that taught me a lot. It certainly taught me humility. When people say, "How much longer you think, Doc?" I have no idea.
That's right.
I can give you some ranges. I can say typically it happens, but I don't do it with any dogma at all. I just say, actively dying, most 2 to 3 days, but there can be really some extraordinary circumstances which they might go longer, they might go sooner. I just can't predict that. But what I can assure you is that we're going to do what we need to do to make sure that if it's a few minutes or if it's a few days, they're comfortable, and that you're supported as well.
Yeah. So good. You could be my doctor.
Well, excuse me.
All right. You said you had a second story that was quick. You want to share the second one?
It sort of relates to that.
Sure.
In that this was a different circumstance. This was an older woman. She probably was 10 years older than Mary was. She was in her 90s, and she had a combination of Alzheimer's disease and a stroke, and was, I would say, somewhat of a stereotypic person at that level, who was mostly in a fetal position, completely unresponsive, except that if you put a spoon of applesauce next to her mouth, she'd slurp it. So that allowed her to sustain for quite a while. I mean, she had very little metabolic activity, so she didn't need much to sustain her. And she really didn't have anything else going on other than the after effects of the stroke and the profound effects of the dementia. She got to the point where she no longer was slurping that applesauce anymore. And so we knew that she was, again, on this track toward actively dying. And just for the record, she followed the textbook on this one. But before she died, I was in there. It was early on a Saturday morning. It was very, very quiet. And I would check in on her every day. And on this particular day, I went to the bedside as I always do. I grabbed her hand as I always do. I think touch is important. And I went to check her pulse as I always do. Not because I was going to change it, but just because that is a medically appropriate way to touch people. Touch is important. And if I'm checking their pulse, nobody's going to complain about that.
Yeah.
So I'm checking her pulse, and having done that for several days running, is very similar to what I described with the last patient. Thin, thready, irregular, barely palpable all the time. That's what it was. This morning, I took her wrist and felt that pulse, and I felt this bounding, rhythmic it was. I'm thinking, what is going on here? And then I paused and listened in the background, very quietly. There was a CD playing. This was a few years ago. They still had CD players. And it was piano renditions of hymns. And the hymn that was playing was, "Search me, O God, and know my heart today." It's a beautiful 3/4 waltz hymn of the faith. It's decades, if not centuries old. I grew up in the church. My mom was a pianist. I knew that hymn well. And her pulse was beating in perfect rhythm with this song. As the pianist would speed it up, her heart rate would speed up. As it would slow down, her heart rate would slow down. The song ends, and she goes right back into her thready rhythm. Irregular. She was well aware of, number one, what was playing in the room. She was well aware of my presence at the bedside. And through that, she was telling me, this is what I believe. This is my hope. This is my salvation. And I want you to know it.
Yeah.
And again, I think it's a powerful message for people to understand the awareness. We may have some responsiveness changes that I'm not able to relate anymore, but the brain is still pretty active. The areas that define our character and our soul, they're still very much alive.
Yeah. It is so easy, I think, for healthcare workers, maybe easier when we think that that person is not there, not listening, because it's, a compartmentalization thing. You can just set that aside. That's my patient, but that's not a person in that way. But it's important then to remember that they are there.
Yes.
And they are still a person, and they are not just the patient. They're a person. They're somebody's mother. There's somebody's wife. There's somebody's daughter,
Absolutely.
Yeah. Good stuff. Well, thank you, Dr. Mulder, for sharing your story with us. Thank you for being on the podcast, and thank you for the work you do. I mean, the field of palliative care is new in terms of medical specialties. It's still
relatively,
it's old, I guess, but in the general scheme of things, it's relatively new. And I appreciate the work that you've done. That's really, honestly, it's paved the way for me to be able to do the work that I do. And you're still doing it for so many years. So I really appreciate that. What a gift. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Cody. I appreciate, again, what you're doing. We have, we're kind of locked arms in terms of just trying to normalize and change the narrative about patients who are dying, patients who are seriously ill, so that they receive what it is that they truly need. And only through venues like this can we really make that happen. So thank you for doing this, and thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to Dr. John Mulder for joining me on the podcast. I so appreciate your commitment to caring for people at the end of their lives and your work in educating others who want to do the same. You can listen to John on the Palliative Matters podcast and find out more about his work at trilliuminstitute.org. And on a personal note, I want to thank John and his co-host, Dr. Jason Beckrow, for their support. From the beginning of our work on the Dying to Tell You podcast, John and Jason were very supportive and were gracious enough to have me as a guest on their podcast. Thank you to Dr. Mulder and Dr. Beckrow for your support. Remember, you can watch all episodes of The Caring Perspective on YouTube, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have more guests coming each week with thoughtful stories of hope and learning at the end of life. Thanks again for listening. This is Dying to Tell You, The Caring Perspective.